Welcome, Juscha. Let's start with you introducing yourself.
So my name is Juscha Grunther. I'm 50 years old. I grew up in Nova Scotia. That was my home base. And I moved to British Columbia in my early 20s. I was a bit of a gypsy vagabond and exploring the world, and fell in love with BC wholeheartedly. Since that time, I sort of have become, I guess you would say I'm self-educated. I did my own studies. I never went to university, but I've been interested in a lot of different subjects, religion, societal problems. I'm interested in natural healing and growth, change. I've been environmentally aware. I guess you could say I've been an environmentalist by proxy for quite a long time. I've probably spent the last 15 to 20 years in New Denver, and that was my home base for a very long time, and I'm now probably looking at relocating to Vancouver Island.
And what got you initially interested in the topic of geoengineering/chemtrails?
Well, I had heard about chemtrails for some years before I actually got involved in the research, but at that time I thought that chemtrails were kind of a fringe conspiracy theory that really only people that were a little bit wacko believed in. And it wasn't until I got sick and I was looking out my window day after day after day and just sort of watching the skies, and began to see one jet after another flying by. This was in New Denver. Every minute, every couple of minutes, there'd be another one going by, and they were all leaving these long white trails that kind of didn't dissipate as contrails do, condensation trails. They sort of lingered and then eventually spread out into a thick, kind of vaguely crisscrossed, webby haze that covered it. You know, the morning would start out beautiful and blue, and by lunchtime it was often hazy and gray and kind of awful looking, the skies. And that made me wonder. So I started to look into what could be causing that. First I was curious, is New Denver on a commercial flight route? Because maybe they were jets that were going from Calgary to Vancouver or Victoria, Toronto, or whatever. And I learned that we weren't actually in New Denver on a commercial flight route. I learned that through a resource called flightradar24.com that gives you in real time where all the commercial flight routes are in the world. So when I discovered that, I thought, well, there is something weird. If it's not a commercial flight that I'm seeing, and I was recording about 60 jets in a 6-hour period on average. And I was photographing them. I started to document everything. I photographed everything that flew. And because I was, not well, I was able to just go out during the day with my camera, and I just, one after another, photographed all of them, everything. So it's all sort of documented, that period of time, which was about 2013. And then I decided to collect a rainwater sample after a week of really heavy, I'm going to call it chemtrail activity, because I don't believe they were condensation trails. So there was a week of very heavy chemtrail activity. I was sort of documenting also the wind directions, so I could determine that it wasn't, whatever was coming down in the rain wasn't coming from the smelter and trail. The wind was pretty much coming from the north during that time. And so I collected the first rainwater that fell, and then I sent it off to a lab on Vancouver Island, North Island Labs. And it came back with extremely high levels of aluminum, cadmium, lead. There was tin and strontium in that rainwater sample. And I don't believe that the strontium is being left by the chemtrails. That might very well be Fukushima, I don't know. But there was strontium in the rainwater. And when I discovered that there was really high abnormal levels of heavy metals in the rainwater, that totally fueled the flames of my research. And
how do you know that everything in the chemtrail, in the rainwater, wasn't from Fukushima, if you're assuming the strontium was from Fukushima?
Well, I don't believe that the nuclear plants put out aluminum, whereas there are rainwater samples that have been taken around the world, and even from such pristine places as Mount Shasta in California. That was one of the most pristine water sources in the world. And there have been water samples that were tested that came back with like 1,000 times the maximum allowable concentration for drinking water guidelines at Mount Shasta.
1,000 times?
1,000 times.
Of what chemicals?
Oh, of aluminum.
Of aluminum.
Aluminum. Barium is also typically found in rainwater samples that other people have taken around the world. That didn't show up as extremely high in my rainwater sample, but aluminum did. It was 36 times the maximum allowable concentration.
Really?
Of
New Denver?
Of drinking water guidelines, yeah. Wow. So I decided to, when I came up with enough, basically I came up with enough information and what I thought was proof that there is, that geoengineering is actually happening, that chemtrails actually are happening, that I decided to send a report off to, he was our MP at the time, Alex Adamanenko. And Alex Adamanenko took my report and took it seriously enough and my research to forward it on my behalf to Canada's Minister of Environment, who at that time was Leona Aglukkaq. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce her name. And he was asking for Environment Canada to look into the really unusually high levels of heavy metals in the rainwater sample and to address my questions and concerns, which I can't say I got a form letter back from them. I did get a letter back saying that what I was seeing was totally normal, that there is no...
Is that from the Minister of Environment?
This is from the Minister of Environment, that there are no chemicals in... Well, let me just quote what she actually said to me. Quote, unquote, she wrote, there are no materials being dispersed within any contrails other than water vapor and the regular byproducts of jet fuel combustion. So
the regular byproducts of jet fuel combustion. And then have you researched what those byproducts of jet fuel combustion are?
I started to, and there was like ethylene dibromide, and I can't remember what else. There were weird things in there that are also really detrimental to health, but aluminum,
it's not one of
lead, no, none of those things are part of
jet fuel
combustion.
And you say that you checked the wind at the time of these rains, and you are pretty sure that this wasn't coming from trail.
Trail smelter. Yeah, I'm pretty sure they were not. So what I did was I would photograph. I would do so I'd go on Environment Canada's weather website. It would tell you what the weather is for that day in any given area. It would tell you what the humidity is and various other information, wind direction, and I would have that as reference. So if the wind direction was coming from the south, I knew it. So I knew that the wind direction in New Denver was pretty much systematically coming from the north at that time.
So you're not getting rain and pollution from trail.
Not on the day, not in that week preceding my rainwater collection.
And most of the times, the wind probably does come from the north, like the northwest is kind of a common direction.
I think
for
so,
wind,
especially
right?
in the spring and winter. It seems to be the case. Yeah.
So then, after you got the letter back from the Minister of Environment,
right.
Then what was your next step?
Well, I wasn't satisfied with her answer, obviously, because she didn't conduct any on-the-ground investigation into what was causing the chemicals in my rainwater sample. I took further rainwater samples and I tested them with little home test kits. I didn't send them off to a lab, but my little home test kits also showed that one of them showed high levels of mercury in the rainwater. So I was not satisfied with her answer, and I continued my research. And I was going to talk about this later in the segment, but to refute Environment Canada's Leona Aglukkaq, I discovered after my report went out to her that Environment Canada was conducting secret behind closed doors meetings on the subject of geoengineering, which I think so let me just quote. So that, it was a leaked memo.
Where did you find the leaked memo?
Well, I found it on I think I might have found it on a website called Geoengineering geowatch.org. This is an excellent resource for anybody that is interested and would like to learn more about geoengineering.
Okay.
So in this memo sent to the Deputy Minister of Defense in Canada, the Canada Security Intelligence Service Director was at that meeting. The Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Trade was there, and the National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister. So all of these defense-oriented organizations were all at this secret meeting for geoengineering.
And where was it held?
It was, I'm not sure where it was held, but it was held on July 5th in 2012.
Okay.
I could probably find out where it was held, but I don't have that information right offhand. But as part of the presentation that they gave that day, they described geoengineering, and this is quote unquote, geoengineering, the deliberate large-scale intervention in the Earth's climate system. So that was in 2012. That was just 1 year before she wrote me back this letter saying, there are no materials being dispersed within contrails other than water vapor and the regular byproducts of jet fuel combustion. And yet, also as part of this this meeting that was being presented, they described, quote unquote, the injection of sulfur aerosols directly into the stratosphere using airplanes, rockets, and balloons, etc. So they were talking at least of putting sulfur aerosols into the stratosphere.
Sulfur aerosols. And so did you research what they meant by sulfur aerosols?
Well, as far as, no, I never did really. I think sulfur aerosols are typically associated with volcanic action and some pollution of, I can't remember. Yeah, I don't have the information on that.
Okay.
But they talk about, so when they talk about, they don't use the word chemtrails. If you talk about chemtrails to anyone who's involved in actually doing the chemtrails, they say, we're not doing chemtrails. Mm-hmm. They'll say, we're doing solar radiation management. We're doing stratospheric aerosol geoengineering. Mm-hmm. You talk about chemtrails and they're going to just tell you you're full of you know what.
I know, and if you look on Wikipedia, chemtrails are
considered
defined
a hoax
conspiracy theory. But if you look up geoengineering,
you will find tons.
They talk about weather modification.
Yeah. If you look up geoengineering, you'll find organizations such as the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations. They're huge in promoting geoengineering, and they have had big meetings and discussing geoengineering as a possible method of saving the climate. So geoengineering is basically going to be sold to the public as a way of saving us from climate change. So it's dangerous because everyone is getting hyped up about climate change, and it's a very scary subject. Storms are out of control. There's fires like crazy. There's storms and floods that never used to be. It's kind of huge what's happening in terms of climate change right now. And what's particularly scary is that the people or the organizations that are sort of responsible for chemtrails and geoengineering are the very ones that are basically giving us our climate data and that are pushing climate change as an anthropogenic, that is basically carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases causing it.
So you found some evidence in your research somewhere to suggest that there's been geoengineering going on
since the 1960s at the very least. I have a couple of, so these are documents that eventually became released under the Freedom of Information Act. But NASA, back in 1967, had a paper called A Recommended National Program in Weather Modification. And that was in 1967. Back at that time, the departments that were... Well, first of all, I'll give a couple of quotes from that document.
Okay.
Let me see if I can find it here. They were talking about having done field experiments were occurring over South Dakota and Arizona, as well as California, Washington, Montana, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. and that development of technology will be proceeding at a high pace. They do actually talk about releasing chemicals through these programs. Here's another quote. This one was made by the portion that was being governed by ESSA. And ESSA at that time they eventually became NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And NOAA is basically responsible for collecting data around the world on climate and weather systems. And that data is being used to, in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the various reports that they're putting out, the Fourth Amendment report, Fifth Amendment report, Sixth Amendment report. So NOAA is basically most of the information in the IPCC is being used from NOAA's data. They collect it through satellite and earth stations and whatnot. Okay. But what I also learned, and this is a little of an aside, NOAA is getting most of its data from the Department of Defense. And the Department of Defense...
And this is the American Department
This is the American Department of Defense. The American Department of Defense is really hugely involved in the worldwide geoengineering programs that are happening. So in 1967, the Department of Defense was part of that recommended national program in weather modification. So was the National Science Foundation, the Federal Aviation Administration was part of it, NOAA was part of it, the Department of Agriculture, and, ESSA is part of NOAA, and then NASA. NASA was the one that wrote this paper, and that was sort of the spearhead for that program at that time.
So in any of these documents, again, starting with this initial one in 1967, do they say why they want to do geoengineering?
Well, I would have to do more research on that. There's been a large question in the community that has been trying to expose this agenda for a long time. Some people are saying that they're wanting to control the weather so that they can control agriculture and whatnot. So if you create drought in an area, then you drive the prices up on produce. Also for war making, if you want to go to a country and destabilize it, you can create storms and whatnot. And if you think that's a far-fetched statement, I'm just going to give you, this is a quote from the 1996 Air Force document. It's called Weather as a Force Multiplier, Owning the Weather in 2025.
Is this the American Air Force?
This is the U.S. Air Force. They say extreme and controversial examples of weather modification, creation of made-to-order weather, large-scale climate modification, creation and or control or steering of severe storms, etc., were researched as part of this study. The weather modification applications proposed in this report range from technically proven to potentially feasible. So they're saying that control of storms is absolutely possible. And there's also a man by the name of Ben Livingston. He was a commander in the Air Force in the U.S. back, I think in the 60s and 70s. And at that time, he was saying that they already had the technology to not stop storms in their tracks, but to control them sufficiently that, like a hurricane like Katrina, he actually says that Hurricane Katrina, the destruction could have been reduced by 90%. So in my mind, and in Ben Livingston's mind and others, we're thinking that if these storms are at least being allowed to continue and they have the technology to stop them, it's for political reasons, that they're allowing such huge devastation to be caused.
Right.
So I'll talk about more about that later, but I do believe that climate change is going to be used by these various departments in the US and other countries around the world, their equivalent, to impose large restrictions on the various populations. It sounds far-fetched, but there are already people in the security departments in the US and the government saying that climate change is the next major threat to national security. So whenever something becomes a threat to national security, the restrictions come down. So the last huge threat to national security was 9/11. When, and I, some people may now believe that those jets going through those towers were terrorists, but there's been a lot of proof to show that actually it was a planned event. I won't go into that. That's another conspiracy theory for another day.
Yeah.
But it was used strategically by the government to be able to go and invade the Middle East so that they could get control of the Middle East's oil and gas resources. So not only did they get control of the Middle East's oil and gas resources, we also now are being monitored around the clock through our cell phone calls. Our emails are being routinely, every day, they're being, if not actively being read, they're being monitored. So our privacy has vanished out the window. There is no such thing as privacy anymore. According to another guy who is in British defense in the telecommunications industry, he's now retired, but he says even when your cell phones are turned off, they are still actively monitoring you.
Even when they're turned off?
Even when they're turned off. So when I hear threat to national security, I hear danger to the population at large. It's all strategically being used. So climate change and the threat of climate change is the one thing around the world that all the nations can agree on. Yes, this is a major threat to national security. Yes, we need to have some serious impositions and restrictions put in. And I'm not saying that greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide aren't driving climate change, but I do question how much of it actually is responsible for climate change and how much is responsible for the 50 years plus of climate and weather manipulation by the various governments around the world. And it is happening around...
So you're saying that you're wondering if this weather modification that's been going on for 50 plus years, and you do have documentation.
I have documentation, yeah. So from the first NASA document, there's another... there's one called An Introduction to Weather Modification by the Air Weather Service, which was part of the United States Air Force. That's 1969. Then there's the 1997 document, Owning the Weather by 2025. That's the U.S. Department of Defense. They talk about...
Owning the Weather by 2025. And that's a document that...
It's called Weather as a Force Multiplier, Owning the Weather in 2025.
And where did you find that document? Like, how did...
That was another... So that one was never a classified document. That one is... They say it's a research document. So by saying that, they can basically... by claiming it's research and not actively happening...
Right, they're researching.
They can get away with publicly putting it out at large, and they don't have to take responsibility for what's happening. However, that document was actually researched by a group called, what were they called? They were a Belgian environmental watchdog group. And I can't remember when they were doing this, but they hired a group of aerospace engineers to research the subject of chemtrails and whether chemtrails were actually an actual fact or just a conspiracy theory. Mm-hmm. So those aerospace engineers, they never actually came out and said, yes, chemtrails are happening, but they did say, yes, there are chemicals being ejected, and that this document, that basically at that time, they said about 50% of what they talked about as being merely research had actually already come to pass. And they could tell that by barium, like the orders for barium by the Department of Defense, these huge amounts of barium being bought. They had discovered maps where they were spraying. Anyway, they actually were able to prove that, yes, this spraying scheme was actually happening, and it did involve chemicals, even though they didn't actually use the word chemtrails.
Right.
But they're also...
And they could prove that it was being done by the American military.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So don't be sort of misled by the fact that they're saying this is a research document. It is much more than that. And in fact, in it says, and this also this is what was part of what led me to believe that national security and climate change were going to be linked as a way of controlling whatever it is they're going to choose to control, whether it's our behavior, whether they want to curtail, corporations' emissions. I don't know wherever it goes, but I do believe it's somehow related to the whole.
Well, the curtailing of emissions from factories would be a positive thing.
That's
what the environmental movement
It will be a positive
wants.
thing. However, God, it's so complicated.
You're saying that there's other agendas.
There are other agendas.
Yeah,
there are other agendas
that the environmental movement knows nothing about.
Yeah, that I tend to
believe. And that the environmental cause is being
used.
It's being used. It's being harnessed.
Thank you. That's exactly what I believe. And I'll give you a couple of quotes to support that. He's considered the father of the environmental movement back, I think, in the 70s. His name is Maurice Strong, and he is connected to the Rockefeller Foundation. He sits on the board of directors of the Rockefeller Foundation. Now, most people think that the Rockefeller Foundation is this benign organization that gives out funds to environmental groups and various other deserving projects, and they do, but there's an agenda behind that as well. I believe, and my research and other people's research has shown that the Rockefellers are large in the, I don't know if you want to call it a conspiracy, but some people think there is a conspiracy to control the world's resources through eventually creating a one world government body, a one world government that will be basically ruled by what they call the ruling elite. And Rockefeller himself has said it would have, and this is part of the Bilderberg. I don't know if people have heard of the Bilderberg group, but the Rockefellers founded the Bilderberg group. Mm-hmm. So at a Bilderberg meeting, he said, "It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subjected to the lights of publicity during those years. But the world is now more sophisticated and prepared to march toward a world government. The supranational sovereignty of an intellectual elite and world bankers is surely preferable to the national autodetermination practiced in past centuries." So that was David Rockefeller saying this at a Bilderberg meeting.
It's preferential to autodetermination. Like we don't want you guys to be determining your own lives.
That's right. That was in 1991. So Rockefeller and Maurice Strong, this father of the environmental movement, are very closely linked. Strong sits on the board of directors for Rockefeller Foundation. Rockefellers have founded, so Maurice Strong basically began through the United Nations, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He since then has made millions in carbon credits. He made millions in the oil and gas trade. So for me, that was what raised my alarm bells. Here's an environmentalist making millions in gas and oil.
This is Maurice Strong you're talking about.
Maurice Strong. Mm-hmm. And Maurice
and
Strong.
What year did he start the environmental movement? Or was he spearheading it, let's say?
He began, so he was, let's see. So he set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, in 1998. And that was part of the United Nations program.
Although I think you could probably argue that the environmental movement has been going since
much before that.
Since Rachel Carson's book in the 1950s.
I'm stating what I read online, that he's considered the father. So I think he was involved in environmental issues before that time. Uh-huh. All I know is that in 88, that's when he began the United Nations IPCC.
Okay.
So he wrote, he wrote this. This was part of an interview with a magazine called West Magazine in 1990. He said, "What if a small group of world leaders were to conclude that the principal risk to the Earth comes from the actions of the rich countries? So in order to save the planet, the group decides, isn't the only hope for the planet that the industrialized civilizations collapse? Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about? This group of world leaders form a secret society to bring about an economic collapse." So that is part of the Bilderberg schematic as well.
That's written in a Bilderberg document?
No, this was part of an interview with West Magazine in 1990, but Maurice Strong is also part of the Bilderberg movement.
Oh, and that's what he said.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, interesting.
So this is all connected, and somehow I believe it's all connected to the climate change catastrophe being largely engineered to create not only not only an environmental collapse of sorts, but to create also an economic collapse. So that the more destabilization there is in the world, the more this group of world leaders, whatever you want to call them, the more they can kind of gather control. As Henry Kissinger said, Henry Kissinger is also part of this whole Bilderberg schematic. Henry Kissinger was the national security advisor to at least 2 presidents in the past. Mm-hmm. And Kissinger stated, let me see here, today, Americans would be outraged if United Nations troops entered Los Angeles to restore order. Tomorrow, they will be grateful. This is especially true if they were told that there was an outside threat from beyond, whether real or promulgated, which means created, so a created threat, that threatened our very existence. It is then that all people of the world will plead with their world leaders to deliver them from this evil. So I really believe that climate change is going to be used for this purpose. Among other things, any destabilization they can create is going to, basically, as he said here, it will make us plead for them to deliver us, to save us.
Okay, so getting back to the former point in
Right.
my question, you have found some evidence to suggest that there's been geoengineering, weather modification, going on since the 60s, and that this weather modification has itself contributed to the current climate crisis that we're seeing.
Yes, that is my belief and the belief of many others who have started to research the subject. There are scientists, biologists, doctors who, once you start to look into it, once you start to do your own research, and you don't have to take my word for any of this, there are some really excellent resources out there that people can do their own research. And geoengineeringwatch.org is a really good one. If you want to see whether the lines in the sky that you're seeing, whether at that moment they're actually being caused by chemicals or by water vapor, you can go on a website called the University of Wyoming has a data center that they give out to their students of climatology. This is going off topic again. But basically, you can prove at any given altitude, you have to have over 70 to 75% humidity to create a long-lasting condensation trail and minus 60 degrees Celsius or colder.
And okay. And usually at those high altitudes, it is really up.
It's really cold up there. Mm-hmm. Minus 50 degrees is normal, minus 40 degrees is normal. But to get those two conditions together is actually extremely rare. It rarely happens that you actually get condensation trails.
How rare would you say? Are there numbers on that?
Well, there's a scientist, his name is Clifford Carnicom. Now, he's another good resource. He doesn't talk about chemtrails, but he's researching illnesses that are associated with chemtrails. And as part of his research, all he says is that it is extremely rare to get those conditions. Right. And if you go on this University of Wyoming climate website, you can see for yourself. If you look day after day after day, what is the temperature and humidity at 11,000 meters? 11,000 meters is typical commercial flight altitude because for some reason you get better gas mileage up there at that altitude. So that was kind of the data that I was looking at, was at about 11,000 meters. And as I started to go back to all the pictures that I had taken, I went back to the day, the time, and I went to that website, and none of those pictures of those long white lines that I took, none of them met the requirements for a condensation trail.
Because you could look at the humidity and you could look at the temperature at that, even the temperature at that level you could look at as well. Wow,
yeah, because
that's all documented.
Yeah, they give you humidity, wind direction, and the temperature at, I think, from about 100 meters above the Earth to all the way up to something like, I can't remember, 30,000 meters or more. Right. So you could select what altitude you wanted to get your data from. In addition to that, I discovered another resource called flightradar24.com, which tells you where the commercial flights are at any time. It gives you in real time. So if you see a plane going across your skies, you can go on Flight Radar 24 and see whether there is an actual commercial flight that's scheduled to cross your skies at that time. If there's nothing flying across your skies on that, they show you a map basically, and then they show you a little icon of a jet, and they'll tell you what that jet is, where it's going, where it's coming from, when its estimated time of arrival is, even what altitude it's flying. So it'll give you all that information. And if that information isn't there, then what you're seeing isn't a commercial flight. You're seeing a military jet or something else.
Something else. And so were you ever able to find out what these flights were? Is there any way you can find out?
So what I was doing for a time was I would see a jet. I would run inside and get onto my computer, check it out on Flight Radar 24. I checked about 80 planes in New Denver in 2013. Just after my report went out. So it wasn't part of my report to Alex Adamanenko, unfortunately. But what I discovered was that none of those jets were registered on flightradar24.com. Not one. And then I gave up.
And so, and that site doesn't just, it registers
it'll tell
private jets as well as commercial.
Yes.
So they're not privately registered, they're not commercially registered.
That's right. So there's something else.
So, but military jets don't have to register on
They don't have to register.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and then so that led me to think, well, gee, it seems strange. Like I found it hard to believe that Canada would allow U.S. military to spray our skies. But I discovered that there was actually, I can't remember when this was, and I'm afraid I don't have that information to hand. I'm not as prepared for this interview as I would have liked to have been. But there was a tripartite agreement between Canada, the US, and Britain. I believe that was in the 1990s, but I could be wrong. But at that time, it was a spraying scheme that allowed biological agents and chemicals to be dispersed over various populations. And that was a legal binding document of some kind. And I can't remember what it was called, but tripartite agreement, and then the three nations, that was part of the title of that agreement. Right. So I know that was happening at least in the 90s.
And that's biological agents as well.
As well. Mm-hmm.
And so what's the purpose of the biological agents? Did you find any information on that?
I believe that what's happening is that to some degree that some of the stuff is being tested. So you're using us as guinea pigs, possibly.
And there is documentation of that having happened in the past.
There is. And in fact, there's a bill in the U.S. Anyway, I don't know about Canada. I assume there's something similar. But in 1977, they passed a bill. It's called Public Law of the United States, Law 95 to 79, Title 8, Section 808, et cetera, et cetera. It says, quote unquote, the Secretary of Defense may conduct tests and experiments involving the use of chemical and biological agents on civilian populations. Public Law of the United States.
And from what year?
That was 1977.
They really?
Yeah. Yeah. So, and unfortunately, so many of these operations are being conducted behind the curtain of black operations, which means that you are not allowed to have access to any of that information, even under Freedom of Information Acts. It's completely hidden from the general public, and it's completely hidden from probably most, even within government. It's just inaccessible, black operations, and they're allowed to do that legally. For national security purposes, of course.
Now, what about Canada? Canada's laws? Do we have?
Right. So Canada, I don't know as much about Canada's laws, but when I found that Environment Canada leaked memo on geoengineering, I have to assume that there is something happening either directly with Canada's military or through the explicit consent with the military in the U.S. and NASA. We do have a number of connections militarily that connect us to the U.S. So there's the Government of Canada's CCC, the Canadian Commercial Corporation, which basically we share like $1 billion in contracts for goods and services, where our Canadian companies deliver to the U.S. Department of Defense various services and equipment needed. And that was found, I think, on the NASA website and the CCC website. So it's a trade agreement of sorts, or an existing partnership arrangement. They call it a pre-existing partnership arrangement. So it's between the Department of Defense production in Canada and the U.S. Departments of the Army, Navy, and Air Force. Then there's the U.S. Defense Production Sharing Agreement with Canada. That was signed in 1956. So for sharing defense from 1956, you have to assume, since the U.S. Defense is conducting a national program in weather modification, that was the NASA document I mentioned earlier, that somehow that's bleeding over into Canada in some way, shape, or form. Then there's NATIBO, which is the North American Technology and Industrial Base Organization. And in its mission statement, it says, in support of North American national security, the NATIBO facilitates technology and industrial base efforts between the U.S. and Canadian defense departments. So there's that. And then there's NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, which is a U.S.-Canada Joint Military Command, and that was also created in 1957. So given that we have all these defense sharing agreements, it seems to be all one thing now.
Right.
So what's happening in our skies, what's happening over U.S. skies, it's all connected.
Right. Yes, I can remember being a child in the 70s and always looking up, Saskatchewan, southern Saskatchewan, beautiful
deep blue skies.
And
blue skies.
Yes, and you just looked up and you'd watch the planes with the contrails, and the contrails would always, they'd be out there. But they would vanish. They vanish.
Yeah.
I never had seen a chemtrail in my life, like one of these trails like you described, that like it stays and then it spreads out with spider webby, and then there's a whole bunch of them crisscrossing around, and then there's haze. I had never seen that until living in Nelson, and I think it was started maybe around in 2005 or 4 or somewhere in there.
Yeah.
And
you rarely ever see those deep blue skies we used to have. Like, young people today probably don't even know what a truly pristine blue sky looks like.
Well, I thought, I believe that this summer, I think we had a reprieve from them this summer.
I think we did too, actually.
And then I noticed them happening in the last, around the end of August again. They started up again. And then it's interesting too, because around that time, there's a bunch of viruses that were going around.
Yeah.
Just after I looked up at Pulpit Rock, I saw these chemtrails, and it's like the next thing I know, people are coming down with this respiratory thing.
Yeah.
And then
there have been actually a number of the rainwater tests that people have done around the world and in the US and various parts of Canada. They have found strange biological agents in some of those rainwater samples.
Yeah, but you didn't. Did you?
I didn't test for that.
You didn't test.
I only tested for chemicals.
Right.
Yeah.
And you.
But it would be something that anybody could do. All you have to do is, wait for a week of heavy activity when you see lots of white lines in the sky. Mm-hmm. Make sure you take your rainwater sample well above ground, so they can't say that aluminum came poofed up in the dust or something, because there is aluminum in the earth.
Yeah.
So you want to get your rainwater sample high enough off ground, I don't know, 12 feet at least, up off ground, and collect your rainwater and have it tested for all of this stuff, biological and chemical.
Right. And when you tested it, where did you send it off to?
It went to North Island Labs on Vancouver Island.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wonder if that same lab could test for both biological and chemical, or if you have to send it to two different
labs.
labs.
I assume they could, because most people use them to test their wells, the water in their wells or whatever, right? So they want to make sure there's nothing that can make you sick.
Were the people at the lab surprised at what the results? Or
I have no idea. I just got back a formal report saying this water does not meet drinking water guidelines, and then they outlined which chemicals had higher amounts than was safe to drink.
Right. So people around here, don't be drinking rainwater.
I know. People say, I collect my rainwater and we use it to water our plants and we drink it. And I'm going, wow, that stuff is more toxic than probably even what you would get in city drinking water.
Yeah, and then the sad thing is that's going into our lakes.
It's going into everything. Oh, here's another interesting quote. This is a quote by NASA as part of that 1967 document. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, so yeah, this is from the Recommended National Program in Weather Modification, which was written by NASA and which involved about 7 or 8 national there was a number of defense agencies that were involved in that in the 1960s, including NASA, including the Department of Defense, including the National Science Foundation and the Federal Aviation Agency. Anyway, NASA wrote in that document that, quote unquote, living things are adapted to the weather that actually prevails, and any change in that weather will be generally deleterious to them. So this is just talking about weather. Forget the chemicals. Mm-hmm. This is just the weather. Repeated operations on the scale mentioned are likely to have far-reaching biological consequences. Some of the biological changes would not be reversible. So this was NASA writing this in 1966.
And so they were writing about geoengineering. Is that what they were talking about?
Well, they were talking about weather modification. Back then, it was called weather modification. But okay, they do talk, like I said before. It says, quote unquote, various other nucleating agents as part of the weather modification strategies. It says, various other nucleating agents such as lead oxide will be investigated. So that was 1966. I did find lead in my rainwater sample.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And it says experimental seeding operations, quote unquote again, will be underway primarily by aircraft.
Oh, will be underway primarily by aircraft. And that was in a document in 1966 put out by
the NASA.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, okay. Well, there we have it.
So there is a ton, and if you go on the geoengineeringwatch.org website, they have all of these government documents and more. They have tons of them, like that you can download as PDFs. The actual released documents under Freedom of Information, they have them all on their website.
Right.
And weather, they also have the rainwater tests and the results on that website. It'll tell you what geoengineering actually involves, what solar radiation actually means, what stratospheric aerosol geoengineering actually means, etc., etc.,
etc.
Yeah.
And so now, just getting back to the beginning of the interview, you sent off a rainwater analysis to the Minister of Environment. Did you send anything else off to the Canadian government? Yeah.
So, my report ended up being hundreds of pages long. There were probably about 100 of my photographs of the trails that I was seeing, photographed with the information of... actually, at that time, I don't think I had that information to hand yet. But so later I was able to go back and research, did it meet the actual climate specifications to create a condensation trail, whether it was minus 60 degrees Celsius and over 70% humidity or not, et cetera, et cetera. So I had tons of my photographs. I have one section of my, let's see, I wrote down, actually I did the research on what actually is caused, what the different symptoms are that are experienced by people around the world after they've seen chemtrails.
Been exposed to them.
So there was I did all the research on the symptoms. Let me see if I can find some of that info. I have the Case Orange executive summary that was put out by the aerospace engineers for that Belgian environment watchdog group on, they were researching that 1997 military document owning the weather in 2025 to see whether it was just a research document or whether it was actually like a timeline of actual activity, which they discovered at least 50% of it, at least 10 years ago, 50% of what was outlined in that government document has already come to pass. So much more since then, I'm sure. So I sent him my rainwater lab sample. Where is that?
Can you just off the top of your head tell us what some of the symptoms are from chemtrails?
God, unfortunately, my memory my memory is really bad. I have had, I think I probably have experienced quite a few of those symptoms from those chemtrails, and brain fog and memory loss is one of them. Like aluminum already is well implicated in mind problems such as attention deficit or Alzheimer's.
Your memory seems pretty good.
Well, I've been thinking about this stuff for a long time, so I do have... Oh, okay, here we go.
Okay.
So the general chemtrail illness symptoms, this is... I think I got this off the geoengineeringwatch.org website. So a metallic taste, sinus problems, nosebleeds, hacking cough, asthma-like symptoms, flu-like symptoms, headaches, dizziness, tiredness, memory problems, difficulty thinking, depression, irritability, dry skin rashes, gastrointestinal distress, and diarrhea are all sort of general symptoms that people have recorded after seeing chemtrails.
And who collected that information? Do you know?
I think, like I said, I think I got this information off geoengineeringwatch.org.
Okay.
Yeah. And another part of the problem with the whole chemtrail stratospheric aerosol geoengineering program is that they're now using nano-sized particles. So nano-sized particles are so tiny that they cross the blood-brain barrier. They go right into your skin. You can put like I saw on YouTube, they had some kind of nano-sized particulate, a glob of something that was nano-sized particles, and they put it on their finger and it vanished into their skin. Like it just absorbs right into you. Wow. So you breathe that stuff in, it goes right into your bloodstream, it goes right into your brain. Wow. So it is no small thing.
No.
But I mean, asthma is like on the rise. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, it's become like practically epidemic proportions. And people are going, oh, well, it's because people are smoking more. But it's not the case. People are smoking less than ever before.
Less.
Yeah, like I read somewhere, I think there was a headline said COPD, increasing global health epidemic.
Uh-huh. And gastrointestinal problems are also a health epidemic, a silent epidemic.
Yeah. So all these heavy metals, it goes right into our food chain. We're eating it. We're breathing it. It's in our drinking water. It's everywhere. Yeah. And if this has been going on since the 1960s, the burden that's being put on our planet it's practically, I don't even know where you would begin to try to measure it. But one thing I do know is that this information really needs to be included in any studies that are being done on climate change. This information needs to be at least included and as part of what is driving climate change and what is driving extreme weather and storm events. Because, I mean, there are scientists that are saying weather and extreme storms, that they can't even really link it to climate change. There's no, like they're using these extreme weather events to kind of scare us into believing that climate change is going to be a major detriment to society. Mm-hmm.
Like, for instance, I think you mentioned earlier that you were looking at some lightning that you were seeing happening this summer in the Nelson area, and that lightning to occur, there has to be a certain amount of humidity in the air for
not
that?
For lightning to occur, for storms.
For storms
to occur, there need for any cloud to form, you need to have over 70% humidity to create a cloud or to create a long-lasting condensation trail. So there was at one point during the summer that I was doing all this research in 2013, I was seeing storms that were blowing up out of the blue on days where the humidity, according to Environment Canada's website, which I was going on to check what the conditions were, they were saying that the conditions for New Denver were 28% humidity, 33% humidity, and I was seeing storms, big thunderstorms happening, and then huge lightning come down, dry lightning. That summer there were huge fires all around the Valhallas.
Yeah.
So that that was suspicious to me. Like, if there are storms forming on low humidity days, that is not natural. That's not normal. And in fact, part of my research discovered that this is the U.S. Department of Defense again, but they had a section in their budget that was asking for money in 2013 for lightning research, lightning propagation. I don't have the information with me, so I can't quote it, and my memory's not good enough to remember all of that information. But they were looking at accelerating lightning strikes and being able to direct lightning strikes where it actually will hit and land.
This was a document saying that they were capable of doing this sort of thing. And that document came from whom?
This came from the U.S. Department of Defense. I think you could probably, I'm not sure if you can find it on their website, and I don't remember where I got that information, but it was an actual PDF. It was one of these released under the Freedom of Information Act documents. Probably it's found on geoengineeringwatch.org, but I can't remember now for sure. That's where I got it. So you have the U.S. military creating storms, or at least they're experimenting with creating storms or accelerating storms. They do have the capacity to diminish storms, hurricanes, and tornadoes, but they're obviously choosing not to at the very least.
They certainly didn't with Hurricane Katrina.
Yeah, and then you have in that 1997 document, this is also the U.S. Military of Defense, Owning the Weather by 2025, they say, extreme and controversial examples of weather modification, creation of made-to-order weather, large-scale climate modification, creation and or control or steering of severe storms, etc., were researched as part of this study. That was 1997. They also said in that document, the weather modification applications proposed in this report range from technically proven to potentially feasible. So, in 1997, we know that some of this technology had already been experimented on enough that they know that they're able to use it, which means that they've been experimenting somewhere in the world, probably who knows where, everywhere and anywhere.
Well, it's interesting that they had that crazy drought in California.
I know.
And when the weather people kept talking about the extremely resilient ridge that was keeping the rain from the east going into the west. And
then there's the firefighters who are saying, I've never seen fires like this ever in my life. They're saying the absolute explosive intensity, they say we've never seen anything like it.
Yeah.
So these people who are saying those things, they don't know about geoengineering. They don't know what's happening.
Yeah.
So they're just going, wow, this is really bizarre.
But it's suspicious. It's unusual.
Yeah, but here are a number of patents. I'll just give you the names of these patents, and people can research them on their own if they'd like. I won't give you the numbers because they're simply too long, but there's one U.S. patent which is a method for controlling hurricanes. There's another patent. This is...
you have to give us the patent numbers?
I could, but people have to be ready with it's long. They're like 10-digit numbers.
Okay.
They're long numbers.
Right. Yeah.
Here's another one invented, which is associated with the HAARP antenna in Alaska. It's called Cosmic Particle Ignition of Artificially Ionized Plasma Patterns in the Atmosphere. That describes, quote-unquote, manipulation of the steering winds that control the development of mesocyclones or the modification of the directions of jet streams that influence the development of hurricanes. Okay. Possible defense applications include a method of accelerating electrons to MeV energies in conjunction with the HAARP antenna. There's another patent, I won't give you the number, 20 million something or other. It describes a way to create artificial tornadoes. Another patent describes, and this is quote-unquote, method and apparatus for altering a region in the Earth's atmosphere, ionosphere, and or magnetosphere. Here's another patent that talks about using telecommunications, weather control, lightning prevention, and atmospheric heating, which they say is capable with a system such as HAARP. And then last but not least, Gordon J.F. MacDonald. He was the chairman on the ICAS Select Panel on Weather and Climate Modification. He said, or actually, no, I don't have quotes for this, but he describes the use of weather manipulation, climate modification, earthquake engineering, and brainwave manipulation using the planet's energy fields. And he wrote about that in a book called Unless Peace Comes. Actually, no, that was Zbigniew Brzezinski's book. Sorry. Zbigniew Brzezinski was also a national security advisor to one or two presidents in the U.S. And he quotes Gordon J.F. MacDonald, who I believe was a military commander of some kind in the U.S. Department of Defense.
So there's lots of patents out there for weather modification, storm production.
Yes. And
the technology's there. It's been created.
The technology's there. And in fact, Zbigniew Brzezinski goes on to say, technology will make, and this was back in the 70s, technology will make available to the leaders of major nations techniques for conducting secret warfare of which only a bare minimum of the security forces need be appraised, let alone the general public. Techniques of weather modification could be employed to produce prolonged periods of drought or storm.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Juscha. And
for what it's worth, I really encourage people to go and do their own research and just
and look at the sky.
And look at the sky. Don't just be looking at your iPods and your iPads and your laptops like your Blackberries. Look at what's happening.
Look up. Yeah.
Look up.
Sheep, look up. Okay, on that note, thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much for letting me talk about this on your program. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. Bye.